Hey, thanks so much for signing up for this. I'm really excited to jump in here and start sharing some of these essential tweaks with you. So, without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump in. This first thing on my list is something I've probably been doing longer than anything else on the list, and that's limiting the width of my website using a wrapper. Essentially, this caps off my website's widths to 1920 pixels. Of course, you'll be able to change that to whatever makes sense for you. But this ensures that when somebody's using an ultra wide monitor, that my background images don't get scaled way out of proportion or look silly inside of the container. Honestly, it's a whole lot easier to just show you how this works, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. Now here on my agency website, I've gone ahead and taken the wrapper off that I already had in place so I can show you kind of what it looks like without one. Now I'm gonna have to emulate this because I don't have an ultra wide monitor, but we can get a sense of what happens if I just simply zoom out in my browser here. You can see as I zoom out to kind of emulate that ultra wide monitor, my background image is still stretching from one edge of my screen to the other edge of my screen. It's actually changing quite a bit of what you can see inside that image, especially as we get out to really wide monitors. We can see the image is stretching all the way to the side while the content is kind of squished in the middle. To me, I really don't like the contrast between these ultra wide sections and then the centered sections. Even just the colored backgrounds are going to the edges, and I really just do not like this look. However, with the wrapper back on, we can refresh and you can see now my website is contained to this 1920 pixels. Obviously, again, we are emulating this just by zooming in and out, but you can see that it's kept the proportions of this image inside the background of my section, similar to what it was back when I had this full screen on my monitor. This just makes sure that no matter how wide someone's monitor is, you're gonna have a pretty consistent look across your website. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can add this wrapper to our site. I actually used to do this with two different GeneratePress elements, one to open the wrapper and the other to close it. But just before recording this video, my buddy Taylor Drayson shared a PHP snippet with me that will do the same thing, but not waste space in our elements. So to add this, I'm gonna go to the theme file editor and the functions.php file here of my child theme. If you're not using a child theme, you could use a plugin like Code Snippets, or if you're interested in getting started with a child theme, I do have a video listed down below that will show you how to do that. Once I'm here in this theme file editor and in my functions.php file, I'm gonna go ahead and paste this code, which of course you can get down below this video. Let me explain what it's doing. Here in this first action, it's actually finding the generate before header hook, and it's just adding a div with the class of site wrapper. We're gonna need that class on there so we can add some CSS here in just a moment. Then in the second action, it's going and finding the generate after footer hook, and it's simply closing the div. Basically, all we're doing here is creating a wrapper that goes around the entire beginning and end of our website. We'll go ahead and update this file here, and we can go into our style sheet to add the CSS we need to control this wrapper. Again, if you're not using a child theme, you could go into the customizer and add the CSS, or inside of a code snippets type plugin. So what we're gonna do here is target the site-wrapper selector, and we're gonna give it two declarations. The first one is a max width. Here in my case, I'm gonna do 1920 pixels. That is what I see most commonly used as a big monitor size without getting to one of the ultra wides, so that works for me. But if you wanted to change this value, this is exactly where you do it. The last is to set a margin inline of auto. And this is just gonna make sure we have the same margin on the left and the right, which will center our website in the screen. With both of those things in place, we can go ahead and hit update file, and we're good to go. Now it's important to remember, this is not the content width of the website, which you would see how all this content is stopping here. To set the content width, you go into the customizer, go to layout, container, and set this container width here. What we're dealing with right now is the actual site wrapper, which goes to the edge of the website. That's really gonna control anything that you set to be a full width section. Both GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks have come a long ways in terms of giving us the controls we need to do the different types of stylings across our website. Unfortunately, there are a few things that I still find myself needing to use that there are no controls inside the UI for. To solve for this, I've actually created a simple list of utility classes inside of my starter site. That way I can reference these classes on any element and make use of these different functions. The first of these utility classes is aspect ratio, which I actually use on images and background images pretty regularly. I'm going to show you here an example of why this comes in handy, and then we'll jump into taking a look at the code and exactly how it works. So you can see here in this layout, I actually have three different cards where I've used an image, a heading, text, and a button. Unfortunately, all the images are of different proportions, so it's made my cards look a little funky. Now here inside the Generate Blocks UI, I could click on these images and set the height to, let's say, 250 pixels on all of them. We'll go ahead and do that. And we make sure to set the object fit to cover, which I'll go ahead and do on all three of these. And you think you'd solve the problem, right? But unfortunately, as we go down to tablet, now this 250 pixels is too big. The proportion of the image has completely changed. And again, as we get to mobile, the proportion has changed again. So aspect ratio actually fixes this by just locking in a proportion for your image rather than a fixed height and width. Now, to demonstrate this, I've gone ahead and added one of my utility classes for the aspect ratios here, but don't worry, here in just a second, I'm going to show you exactly how they work. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this first image here. We're going to go down to the advanced, and under additional CSS classes, we're going to do AR-16-9, which is the utility class I've set up for a 16:9 image. We'll go ahead and paste this same class into each one of these images and update it. Now we can see that these images are all keeping the same exact proportions, but even better than that, when we go to the inspector here for the responsive view and we start shrinking our screen, we can see these maintain the same exact aspect ratio no matter what. They're always maintaining that 16:9 aspect ratio. This makes it so much easier when you upload images that might not be perfectly sized the same way, and we know that's exactly what clients will do once we hand the site over to them. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this code works. I've actually built in 4 different aspect ratios that I seem to use most commonly. The first one is 16:9, which we just saw. The second one is the vertical equivalent of that, which is 9:16. Then I have 4:3 and 1:1, which will produce a square. Now, all we have to do is go add one of these classes to any of our images or containers, and we can go ahead and maintain that aspect ratio. Now, if you find that you need a different aspect ratio, it's actually really easy to add. I'm going to go ahead and create one for a 3:4 to give us a vertical equivalent for our 4:3. So here, I'm just going to type in AR-, we'll do a 3-4 to keep up with our naming convention, and then we'll do an aspect ratio, and we'll do 3/4. Go ahead and finish that off with a semicolon and hit update file. Now, if we jump back into our editor, we can go ahead and select our image. We'll go back down here and we'll change this aspect ratio to a 4:3. Go ahead and copy this, and we'll make sure we add the same one to all 3 of these images, hit update. And when we refresh on the front end, we can see the proportions of all of these images have changed. Honestly, this feels like something Generate Blocks will probably add into the UI eventually, but for now, this little trick for using a utility class works perfectly. My next utility class isn't something I use quite as often, but it really does come in handy because going and trying to look for this code every time you need it is a real pain in the butt. And this is for visually hiding things from your website. The reason the way I'm doing this is particular and not just throwing a display none on it is because we're thinking about accessibility. Oftentimes we have scenarios where we want to hide something from the front end of our website, but we still need screen readers to register these elements. They still need to show up inside of our DOM. And the visually hidden class helps me do this in an accessible way. A couple good examples of this are for descriptive link text or skip to content links. So let's take a look at how this code works. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on accessibility here, but from what I understand, this option is a whole lot better for hiding something visually that you still want to show up inside of screen readers or accessible inside the DOM. I use the class visually-hidden here because I want to be really explicit about what this does. Because if somebody stumbled upon this code, they might not really understand exactly what it's doing. We're setting a clip path, we're setting an explicit height, we're taking the overflow and making it hidden, we're positioning it absolutely, and doing all kinds of tricks to hide this from the screen. People might not understand what we're doing if we had something that was hyphenated for a class name, so I think going with something like visually hidden makes a lot of sense here. Speaking of accessibility, another thing I do by default in my sites is set all my links to have underlines by default. However, there are times when I have links that I don't want an underline for. This comes into play in menus or things like a footer. Unfortunately, there's no good way to set this up to remove the underline from links within the editor, so I've set up a simple utility class to handle this for us. All we're doing here with this utility class is setting the text decoration to none. Now for this, I do use the class no-ul for no underline, but that's something that's pretty easy for me to remember, and I would imagine if somebody stumbled upon it, they could figure this out pretty easily as well. We're going to go ahead and move to the third tweak here, which is another super simple snippet of CSS, but it's not quite a utility class. However, this thing has saved me tons of time over its use on all my projects. Back to our example of the cards. Don't you get annoyed by the extra bottom margin of paragraphs in designs with cards like this? In most cases, sure, you want to have some space in between your paragraphs, but it drives me nuts having this little extra, what looks like padding at the bottom of cards where it doesn't belong. To fix it, you actually need to grab this paragraph block, turn it into a headline block, turn this tag into a paragraph, and go over here to your bottom margin and zero it out. This seems like a lot of work for something that you're going to have to do maybe dozens or hundreds of times across an entire website. But this next snippet of code actually eliminates this hassle in most use cases. Back here inside my style sheet, I've gone ahead and pasted in this next bit of code. What it does is it finds a p tag that's inside of a generate blocks container that is both the last child and the last of type. Then it sets its bottom margin to 0. In effect, what this does is programmatically change these exact scenarios to automatically set this bottom margin to 0. So with this in here, let's go ahead and update this file. I'm going to go back to our cards here, update it, and we'll go take a look at the front end. Now you can see these other two paragraphs where we didn't change them to generate blocks headlines and change them to a p tag and remove the bottom margin are all consistent with the one we did. Our new bit of CSS is going in here and recognizing that this paragraph is inside a generate blocks container and it's both the last child and the last of type. So it's gone ahead and set the bottom margin to 0. Having this done automatically has been such a huge time saver for me, and I can't imagine living without this snippet of code anymore. This tweak is something that I probably get asked about the most inside of my videos, and it's making the back end look like the front end. Often, and as you've seen during this video, when we add CSS, we don't see those changes reflected on the back end inside the editor. This can be really frustrating because there's discrepancies between the front end and the back end, and you're not always sure exactly what you're going to get. This next little snippet of code aims to solve that by enqueuing all the CSS you write into the editor. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't work 100% of the time. Sometimes the things inside the editor style sheet are just too specific that our normal CSS isn't going to overwrite, but I'd say in about 90% of cases, this does the trick. So let's take a look at how this one works. Back here inside of my functions.php file, because this is a PHP snippet, I actually have two different snippets in here. This first one actually encodes all the styles from my child theme style.css file. It enqueues those into the editor. And the second one enqueues all the CSS from the customizer additional CSS settings into the editor. I end up testing a lot of code inside the additional CSS inside the customizer and then finalizing everything inside my child theme style.css file. So these two snippets of code together take care of both of those scenarios. If you're not using a child theme, then you don't really need this block of code. And if your style sheet is named something different, you're going to want to update that here. With those changes added, let's go ahead and update this file and go back into the editor so we can see it in action. If you remember here, we added the class to these to make them all the same aspect ratio, and we added the paragraph bottom margin to programmatically change to 0 in these specific scenarios. So if all that's working, when we update this and refresh it, we should see those changes now reflected in the backend editor since we added this snippet of PHP. We'll refresh here, and we can see our images are now respecting that aspect ratio we set up earlier. Unfortunately, the bottom margin on our paragraphs still isn't showing in the back end, and this is a good example of the editor styles kind of overriding the CSS we're writing. Now this one we can actually fix pretty easily. I'm going to go back in here into our style sheet under our style.css file, and don't worry, I already gave you this code earlier, I just didn't paste it in during the demo. I'm going to paste in this second line of CSS here that gets more explicit about the block editor. So we'll go ahead and update this file now. We'll go back into our example and refresh. and now we can see these bottom margins have been set to 0. So as you can see, using these snippets of PHP to bring in all the style sheet changes into the editor is absolutely huge for the discrepancies you have between the back end and front end, and it makes the whole block editing experience a lot more cohesive. Block patterns might actually be one of my favorite parts of WordPress core, especially now as I've refactored reusable blocks into synced and unsynced patterns. However, I do have two problems with it, but thankfully it's nothing that a little bit of PHP can't fix. I actually love saving out sections I create as block patterns. Not only does this keep me from having to reinvent the wheel time and time again or hunt down things I built to copy and paste them, it gives clients a great starting point so they don't have to start designing from scratch. Unfortunately, when you install WordPress, it comes with a bunch of block patterns already created. Now, I don't want to be mean, so let's just say that they don't often match the aesthetic of my site. This first snippet of code will actually hide away all the default core block patterns so your clients don't find them and so they're out of your way. By default, when you open the block inserter, you have this tab for patterns here. Inside this are all the different patterns that come with WordPress out of the box. This first snippet of code, which I just pasted here into my function.php file, is going to hide away all the core block patterns. I'll go ahead and save this. We'll refresh in the editor. We'll open the block inserter again, and you can see all the default patterns are now gone. This really cleans things up and makes sure that clients don't add patterns that don't match the rest of their site. What you're seeing here under my patterns is actually a pattern I already have created on the site. If you add this PHP snippet, you might not have any patterns in here whatsoever. This actually brings me to my second complaint about the implementation of block patterns is it's almost impossible to find them. We go back into the back end of the website and they're nowhere to be found in here. Actually, to get to them, you have to go edit a page or post you're working on, click these three dots up here, and click Manage Patterns. That's about 4 extra clicks that I really don't think are necessary. This next snippet of code actually adds a link inside your WordPress menu here so you can get directly to your patterns. You can see what I have over here by default. We'll go ahead and update this file, refresh the page, and you can see now we have a new menu item for patterns that will take us right to that page so we don't have to go hunt around and try to find it. This last tweak is actually one of the newest ones I've added to my starter site just this year. We all know that when dealing with SEO, one of the most important things you have to consider is your NAP, or name, address, phone number. Now, these things aren't difficult, but it's very important that they are copy and paste exact duplicates of each other anywhere they're used across the internet. Now, this is especially true across the website where you're going to be reusing things like the company name, the address, and the phone number all across the website multiple times in things like the footer or the contact page. To ensure that these are consistent across the entire website, I've included the NAP into the ACF options page that I've built directly into my starter site. By putting these 3 items in my options page, actually make it 4 because I've included the primary email address, I can then reference them throughout the entire website, in the footer, on the contact page, or anywhere else I share this info, and be certain that I've used them consistently in every instance. What's great about this solution is you can actually build this setup into your starter site and have it ready to roll out on every build without any extra work. Just make sure that when you put this information into your options page, you check it 2 or 3 times just to make sure it's correct. Now, if you're not familiar with an options page or you're not sure how to implement one inside of GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks, I've left a link down below in tweak number 6 that takes you to a tutorial that's going to show you exactly how it works. Unfortunately, there's not a native integration between ACF option pages and GeneratePress or GenerateBlocks at the moment, so it does require a premium snippet by Taylor Drayson in order to get all this working. You can get it for just 20 bucks, and I guarantee it's going to pay for itself pretty quickly. So there you have it, the 6 most essential tweaks I think are important for making a perfect Generate site. Hopefully you learned a few new things, and like I said, all the code is down below this video so you can copy and paste it into your website. Thanks so much for joining us, and like I said when you signed up for this training, I did add you to our newsletter list and I wanted to give you some kind of idea of what to expect next. For the most part, I just send out 1 email a week, and that's our newsletter called the Friday Chaser. Inside of it, I will have a lesson or story that I'm sharing, I'll have links to the best threads from the group, and a curated list of content I either created or stumbled upon throughout the week that I think is pretty interesting. Hopefully you'll really enjoy the newsletter and stay around for a long time, but of course, if it's not your thing, you can always hit unsubscribe. There's an unsubscribe link in every single email I send. Alright y'all, that's all for now, so we'll catch you inside the comments on YouTube.